Good morning, everybody. I'm Melissa Wasserstein. I'm the principal investigator of Screen Plus, and I am delighted to be moderating this panel today. So I think that what we're going to do is just start. I'm going to ask everybody for a quick introduction. And I would also like you, during your introduction, to tell us how your program is interacting with industry. Why don't we start with you, Rich?
It's great to be here again. I'm Rich Scott. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Genomics England, and we're currently designing a program which we're calling our Newborn Genomes Program, to sort of set the context of us as an organisation, which I think is useful to understand how we then work with industry. We are a UK government-owned company, so we have shareholders, but our one shareholder is our Department of Health and Social Care. So if you like, the taxpayer owns us, and our aim is to support our health service, the NHS, patients and the public in the UK, and researchers to bring the benefits of genomic healthcare to everyone. And we do work in a couple of ways. We support the NHS directly in providing a part of their diagnostic whole genome service, where people consent to have their data made available for research. We also present data in what we call a trusted research environment for researchers to come and visit that data, if you like. And that model is a sort of a visiting, we sometimes refer it to as a sort of reading library model, where people can visit the data, not take it away. They can take away sort of summary they might publish on. And we also run proof of concept studies, of which the Newborn Genomes Program is one. And we're in the design phase of the program. So we aren't yet sort of in partnership with specific organisations. We're in discussion with lots of people, pretty much everyone who's been talking today, and others, both thinking in industry and who are sort of in the field more generally. The way we do work currently with industry in our existing work, I think, is relevant though. So I guess we work in two modes with industry. We work one in sort of delivery mode, where we have partnerships with different organisations who help us in different aspects of delivery, whether that's in our healthcare work. So, for example, we have a contract with Illumina, who both deliver the lab service for us and the machinery for our short read whole genome sequencing, which is the mainstay of our practice. Also with other sequencing providers in some of the pilot programs we have. Also various technology companies for example, aid interpretation, and in our research environment. So again, sort of service provision. And then we also make data available to researchers who include industry, and our participants in all of our programs are really passionate about that being really important. And that model's a bit different. The way our research works more in general, as I said, is that people visit the data, and academics visit the data for free, except if they have very large compute costs, with industry to share the cost of the generation of that data. We do ask for payment to support that, and so it's a pay to access model for industry, where the academics, many of them, have been very heavily involved in the collection of data themselves, and that's partly why that model works. So a bit of a long answer, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of how we work.
Hi, I'm Wendy Chung. Our study is called Guardian. We're in the United States, based in New York City. The model that we've got right now is we have partners in terms of the diagnostic aspect. So for that, Illumina as well as GeneDx are our partners in terms of working on that. We had a long 3-year period of participant engagement in terms of this, and an issue in our community in New York City is really one of trust. And so in terms of doing that, we have set this up, at least so far, so that this is not going to be something that's publicly accessible on an individual level basis. That was at their request. On the other hand, our community does want information to be learned from what they're doing, and so we anticipate, although we haven't done it yet and we haven't set up formal things yet, in terms of being able to do queries with partners who have relevant IRB approved or ethics committee approved requests in terms of queries.
All right, so I'm Don Bailey. Hope you remember that from the last presentation. As I showed in our disclosure slides, in our first phase of early check, it really, and I think with all of our projects, it takes a village, to pull all this together, because this is very expensive work, and there are multiple stakeholders that are involved in this. So we started with core funding from NIH. We felt like that was very important, but then began to add both foundation partners and industry partners. We envision that will be the same model that we have for our sequencing work. It will be heavily funded through foundations to begin with, in partnership with industry. I have to say that early in my career, I thought I couldn't imagine myself doing a project funded by industry. I was an academic. I thought, well, that's not what academics do. I've completely done a 180 on, I said 360, a 180 on that, because I found that engagement with industry is so informative, because industry has a whole different perspective on the work that we're doing and on the outcomes, but it's an essential one. And without industry, we're not going to be making the advances that we need to make. We've been able to come to very appropriate agreements with industry about, freedom to publish anything that we find, no constraints on that, but still engagement with industry to discuss results and findings and what they're meaning. And so we have found industry partners to be critical, and will continue to be as we move forward.
Thanks. So
You need to tell us about yours as well.
Oh, okay. So I'll go. So similar to, especially to Don, I think you have multiple partners. Screen Plus is centered on funding from NICHD, but we have 14 partners who are either pharmaceutical partners or patient advocacy partners. So it's a huge effort, and we've developed a fairly complex structure in terms of who's funding what and how that's being allocated, and contracting. So I agree with you. When I started out, I never really thought I would ever be able to, create something like this, because it was a lot more complicated than I thought. But I think that in the now and in the future for programs like there's so many people who have shared common interests, which is, let's figure this out together. Let's all do what's best for the babies, and the most practical approach, I think, is to work together through these groups. So my next question for everybody is, how did this start for you? Who approached who? Did you find your industry partners? Did they find you? How did that work?
So for us at Genomics England, I guess just one extra bit of context, which maybe was implicit in what I was saying, is one of the really fortunate things about being a government-owned company is that our predominant funding comes from government, as well as the services we offer, and that gives us real freedom, which we're very grateful for, to sort of and does influence our decision making. So I think for us, I think. Genomics England as a whole, when we were formed in 2013, in response to the arrival of next generation sequencing and the realistic prospect of whole genome sequencing being something that can hit primetime healthcare. And so its formation there, just as the discussion we've been having today, I think was stimulated by industry, and then informed for us what became government decision making. And likewise, in the formation and the way we've approached this, it's been something that's come from sort of seeing the science. The first stimulus for our newborns program was actually a letter from our previous Chief Medical Officer, Sally Davis, to us at Genomics England to form a group to explore what the questions were, how one might explore it. So it came from the science, but really reflecting what's out there, largely from industry and also the academia and others building on that.
So in my case, it was something, I guess, that I came up with my team with the concept, and then we approached and looked at several different partners in terms of who had the ability, I'm talking about the diagnostic aspect, who had the ability to be able to do something on the scale that we wanted to do, who had the experience to do it accurately. So in doing that, vetted several folks and came up with someone who I think is a good partner who can deliver on that.
Yeah, for us, it's been both directions. I think we started with this fantasy that if you build it, they will come, and we would build early check, and then all these groups would want to be a part of it. And that has been, to some extent, true. We've had a number of industry partners approaching us about our work and asking us to do other work besides early check. I think we've realized that these are more opportunistic or one-off kinds of collaborations that we would like to maybe systematize a little bit more. So we're planning to build a public-private partnership program that's more formalized, because, you know, there are 27 gene therapy companies just in our triangle, the Research Triangle area of North Carolina. There are many, many groups, all with a shared goal, overarching goal, but with different ways to get there and with different endpoints and with different diseases. But we think we can pull together on those common interests to create a more systematic public-private partnership rather than the individual opportunistic ones. We'll still be exploring those as well, but I think it's important to come together as a community on this, which is hard when you've got each person has their own, each group has its own interest, of course. But I think it can be managed in a way that's a win-win situation for everyone.
I think just sort of reflecting on, I really like the way you sort of set out that your thinking, Dr. And when you'll hear Alice and myself talk about our program a little bit later, but one of the things, particularly as we talk to the other groups thinking in this area about really how we're thinking about creating the evidence that comes from our research program and others the same, is recognizing that there are a whole heap of like enormous questions here for us to work through, where the way those will be responded to will differ between different health systems, etc. They'll also need to evolve as evidence and technology evolves, and sort of working out how we work with industry to understand what's around the corner, what might, you know, our programs will build evidence on particular technologies that they use, but also making sure that we set this up in a framework that knows that any given technology will change and also other technologies will emerge, and being really clear with industry about that, and that, you know, promotes that really sort of healthy type of engagement, I think. And that's in everyone's interest, because if we corner ourselves to a very specific approach to this, then we won't get the best for ourselves and from the technologies.
May I just add, this is not actually a criticism, but a compliment for industry, but industry are the disruptors that are forcing change and forcing this discussion right now in a positive way, because you're developing methods to sequence that have not been available before in a much cheaper way. You're developing transformative therapies that are going to fundamentally change the lives of babies in ways that we've never been able to do before. Newborn screening is not, as a system right now, is not ready to rapidly accommodate these disruptions. And so disruptions are healthy. They force a system to grow and to change. And we're at that point right now with newborn screening. We appreciate what industry is bringing to that. It's forcing us to work hard to figure out how to adapt it into a public, how to adapt it into a public health context.
Those are great. Thank you. What do you think is the benefit to industry to help? And industry meaning, I mean, there's a lot of different industries that are supporting this, but just in general, what do you think the benefits are to the various companies that are helping to support your program in their support of your program?
I'm happy to start just because we seem to be in this flow. Well, I think, you know, we're in the same way that we're in this room together. We're in this together, both as sort of people interested in moving the whole area forward and bringing benefit to the population. And so, you know, I think it's very hard for industry alone to generate the sort of evidence and the sort of impact without programs like this. And I think that separation really helps the important separation of each of the different groups, working through how we construct these programs and then potentially an ecosystem afterwards that actually can hold a place for the different industries. We often, you know, whether it's the sequencing organisations, whether it is in drug development and so on. And I think no one part of industry or no one organisation is the answer here. It's about us and multiple different partners working together to make this work. And I think that's the real benefit. And I don't think anyone that I've spoken to sort of has a different sense from that.
I'll just give one very concrete example. So not what I'm going to talk about with Guardian, but in the past we've done a newborn screening pilot study for spinal muscular atrophy. And we did it in 2016 at a time when there actually wasn't any FDA-approved treatment for SMA. But there were just the beginnings of clinical trials with ASOs. And for those of you who don't know SMA, although it's been mentioned a couple times during the meeting, it's a neurodegenerative condition. And so critical in terms of starting treatment, I would argue pre-symptomatically, especially for the type 1 babies. And so we knew the natural history extremely well through data that we had collected through something called the Pediatric Neuromuscular Research Center. So we knew that we could be quite specific in terms of knowing the death by 12 or the death by 24 months of age. And we took a leap of faith in terms of being able to say that we would do newborn screening for SMA actually in the area when we had clinical trials, but we didn't yet have treatments that were proven to be effective. And it's a little bit of a chicken and egg scenario in terms of was that clinical trial actually going to be effective if it wasn't with enough babies who were pre-symptomatic? Because you can actually see from the data that came out of the trials, babies who started treatment when they were 5-6 months of age and already symptomatic for type 1 SMA clearly did not respond nearly as well. And if that clinical trial had been populated by those babies alone, I don't think it would have made the clinical endpoints. And so within this, we had the ability to do, and completely explicit in terms of this within the consenting process, you have the ability to learn this information. We don't have a guarantee of an effective treatment, but you do have an opportunity, if you so choose, completely independently from newborn screening, to do a clinical trial. And with that, some of those babies did actually go into the clinical trial and in fact were some of the best responders in terms of that. And so a very clear and sort of near-term benefit for industry is in terms of if you're at the point of actually accruing and doing a phase 2, phase 3 clinical trial, and especially if early diagnosis, even pre-symptomatically, will afford the best outcome, it's very clear in terms of doing that a potential win-win. Now, not to say that we knew that was going to happen, right? There could have been a lot of side effects. There could have even been lethal outcomes in terms of that, but it does afford that opportunity in addition to all of the usual things, the incidence, the birth prevalence, the natural history, understanding the allelic spectrum across diverse communities, all of that being incredibly important for rare diseases, especially those that are ultra rare.
Right. So, in response to your question, there are several key interdependencies here today that essentially require for them to be successful, require the other. So let's think about sequencing. Sequencing in the absence of doing anything with the information is irrelevant. Why would you do it? So sequencing needs treatments, transformative therapies. Transformative therapies, however, need ways to identify babies with the specific genetic conditions. And so sequencing has to be available in order for transformative therapies to be effective. However, neither sequencing industry or transformative therapy industry will be effective if you can't find the babies. And that's really what our projects are about, is how do you figure out, especially for these rare disorders, how do you offer and screen a large number of babies to find these rare disorders in the real world. And so it's these three interdependencies that I think are essential. And this is why industry is so critical, but it's why our research projects are so critical as well.
We have 2 minutes left, so I want to open up the floor if there are any questions that can be answered in 2 minutes. While people are thinking, let me ask you another question, and we're going to, again, need fairly brief answers to a very huge question. But what kind of information are you sharing with your families about how their data is being protected with all these multiple players involved? You have an industry team, you have an academic team. How are you sharing information about what's being done with their data?
So I think sort of the word transparency is one which I think is really important here through all of our work, and there's no it is so vital to have these organisations deeply involved here, and so as we're in our sort of design phase, so we don't yet have our materials, but actually we're working with potential participants, talking about the models and how this might work. The main thing is to be absolutely clear and in 14 size font about about how these things are set up and what the motivations are, what the potential gains are for the different players. I think that's really key. Our participants in our previous programs, we've learned, are really comfortable with this, but they're also very clear that it needs to be absolutely up there and clear what's going on.
In brief, similarly, during the consent process, both in writing and as we're talking to people face to face.
I don't have much more to add to that. We're in the formative phase of that as well. I think we're trying to balance, and we're all trying to balance assuring parents of privacy and confidentiality, and that we have strict firewalls in there to make that happen. At the same time that we're sharing forms of data to help advance the cause overall. And so how we convey that all in a simple consent form and in a conversation is going to be a challenge. But I think we're all very committed to it.
Are there any questions from the audience? I see one.
For data that is shared with other researchers, what kind of oversight goes into making sure that they're going to use that properly, so they're not trying to do any kind of like inappropriate behavioral genetics studies and do any kind of correlation from that sequence of data?
For our study, a question about what oversight is there of sort of research use. The model that we've adopted is one responding to sort of participants wanting sort of additional assurance over that. So people, as I've said, visit the data, the access to our systems, and we anticipate that this would be a similar model for our newborns program, though that's we're working through the sort of precise details, is that there's a participant representation on what we call an access review committee that makes decisions about access and use of data against an agreed set of uses. And then we're also, because people are visiting the data, able to do sort of audit type approaches to sort of understand what is actually being done, and of course similarly what's coming in and out of our research environment.
Super quick question. So with many partners, who owns the data? This is a question we get from families a lot.
I'm happy to answer. I think the word ownership is an interesting one, and actually in terms of our role, we don't feel that we or anyone else that we partner with owns the data. I think it's very clear that the data is the participants and the participants' families. In sort of legalese to do with sort of data, I think it is also really important to talk about data control and like be realistic about who is controlling the data. In this context, under research consent, we, Genomics England, that's partly why we were formed by our government, act as data controllers and then act on behalf of our participants in sort of making sure the right decisions are made.
I was just going to say we hold the data. I wouldn't say we own the data, but we hold it and we protect it.
I don't have much to add to that. I mean, I think there's this concept of a trusted broker, and I think we're not the owners of the data, but in many cases we broker its use and with strict guidelines. And going back to the question about the previous question, I think we each within our own projects have rules and guidelines for access to data. It's going to change and be very different when these 8 projects and others start coordinating and collaborating with each other. And how does that all work? NIH has quite a few models for networks where there are data coordinating centers. There are partners in a consortium that agree to follow a standard protocol, both for sharing data, for using data, for analyzing data, for reporting data, for who gets publishing rights and so forth. Depending on how we move, Robert, in all of this, I think we're going to have to think about what level of structure, what level of how do we manage that kind of question among our consortiums to the benefit of all, but protecting all as well?